Hello, Jan. I'm so glad that you are here on the podcast with me today. How are you?
I'm well, Amy. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much for being here. I would say that most of our listeners know who you are, but in the event that they don't, would you please just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that. I now work at this stage of my very long career. I work primarily as a consultant and trainer. I do trainings with people and consult with schools and agencies part of the time. And then other parts of the time, I continue to do research. I'm involved in three or four different research projects now at various universities. And from the results of that research and other things, I continue to write, to create books and those kinds of things. And the overarching theme is reading, of course, but more narrowly, I have focused for quite a while on one little important aspect of reading fluency. Um, but I do other things as well. Reading assessments, getting the data collection right is really important to me as well. I do work in the area of instructional coaching because for a period of time, I was an instructional coach and learned how challenging and difficult that job is. So those are some of the continued focus of my work, along with dyslexia, another piece of this complex thing called reading. But I have some personal connections to that area as well. I have an adult daughter with dyslexia. So it's those kinds of things that keep me busy and connected with other educators in the world.
And right before we got on, you were talking about how important you feel this work is and how you always want to continue to share because that's how we all grow and we all learn. So I really appreciate you being here. I want to start just by talking up briefly about the science of reading and some instructional beliefs. And then I do want to dive into some fluency questions and have questions about PD and dyslexia for you today.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
The first question I have, and often as a literacy coach, I kind of get the wide eyes when I make this comment. And so I'm really careful to say it anymore because I don't want to upset teachers. And the thought is, many educators feel really discouraged when they hear that 95% of students can be taught to read so they can be successful readers, especially when that hasn't been their experience. How would you respond when teachers kind of give you that wide eye of what do you mean 95% of kiddos can learn how to read?
Well, first of all, we never want to discourage teachers. Anybody who has bravely stepped up to take on this critically important job that is not in any way sufficiently compensated, we want to give those people a big hug and a sense of encouragement. So I would like you are doing, be cautious about saying anything to teachers that would be discouraging. However, we have to tell the truth. We have to talk about facts. And the facts really do indicate for quite a while now that, especially in those early years, and that's where the 95 really comes from, is that we have quite a bit of compelling evidence that at those early stages of teaching the basics of reading, get kids to what Mark Seidenberg talks about. They've achieved velocity. They have mastered the alphabetic principle. They know how to do basic decoding and encoding. They understand the alphabetic principle. They can read, and that velocity, it's not a well defined term, but it's generally thought to be in U.S. schools around the middle of second grade. That with the good instruction, that can happen to about 95% of children. There's a certain percentage because languages reading is a language-based activity. It's really language that usually is the limiting factor, that some brains are simply born with insufficient capacity to acquire necessary language for reading. And so we can always strive for 100%, but there's going to be a certain percentage. But let's go back to how we do that. What the research says really clearly is that it's not on the backs of teachers to do this all by themselves. One of my favorite quotes about the 95% is Sharon Vaughn and Jack Fletcher, who say, we can achieve this when the systems and structures are in place, which means training, curriculum, support from the building leaders, coaches, all of those kinds of things are required. Some in some settings than others, because some settings just have fewer challenges, but many settings have many challenges. And so that idea of systems and structures need to be in place. And a huge part of that system and structure is the teacher, but that teacher has to be well informed, has to have access to good data, has to have good curriculum, has to have coaching supports, because they've got a room full of kids with diverse needs, and they need support to figure out what they should do next and how to do it. So yeah, we don't want to discourage teachers. What we want to do is, though, I think, is put that number in front of all educators, including and especially leaders. Mm-hmm. Leaders need to know that they should embrace that number and be bravely willing to set that for a goal for themselves, and then rally the resources, the never enough time, never enough money, never enough people. But we look at those challenges and say, okay, when we leave more than 95% of children not launched by the middle of second grade, that's on us. And that's their future. So it should be embraced, I think, because it's a fact. Denying that is not going to help us. Being discouraged by it is a reality, but we have to rally together. It's just not going to be one teacher by teacher by teacher. It has to be that the entire system, and putting all the structures in place to collect the right data, to protect instructional time, to provide the professional development, and good curriculum, all of that.
All of it comes together. And that's, as I'm sitting here listening to you, one of the schools that I'm working with this year, our word is consistency. And consistency in the classroom, but also consistency across the building. And so when you're talking and I'm hearing you say, we need to have our leaders involved. And I think it's important for teachers to hear that too, because they do a lot of learning on their own, and they reach out and and they go to conferences and all the things. And so bringing the leaders on board too, and sharing that number with them and saying, if this is true, what can we do? How can we change our system? If we're not seeing that, then that means that there is a system flaw somewhere in our foundation and we need to fix it.
Yeah. And there's good resources for that too. Our wonderful building and district leaders don't need to sit around and think, how do we do this? Or just Google something. I am particularly fond of and recommend to everybody these days the book, It's Possible, that wonderfully encouraging name, It's Possible. And really what they're talking about in that book title, and the authors are Patty Montgomery and Angie Hanlon. And they worked together to bring a very dysfunctional, high risk school system up to and exceeding that 95%. They did it together as practitioners and then wrote about it in this book. It's possible. And they don't just talk about, isn't it wonderful? And it's very, very specific. It's like a handbook. And there may be other approaches that work too, but there it is. It's in a book. And administrators now don't have any excuse. That would be a wonderful holiday gift present for a building principal they can read over their holiday break.
Give it to the leader in your life.
Yeah, give it to the leader in your life.
So thinking of that, I think, and I'm not in any way bashing leaders because, they have so much more than they on their plate
That's right.
reading. But I think as teachers, because we do go out and we do all this research and we are in it, there are some persistent misconceptions. And I think this is kind of the root of what I see working with schools about how reading is learned.
Mhm.
That we really need to address as well. So, yes, we can reach that 95%, but what are some common misconceptions about how we learn to read that might also support teachers and leaders?
Well, just before we had this conversation together, Amie, I was participating, listening to a webinar. Sometimes I present, sometimes I just listen. It was a wonderful webinar organized around screening for students with dyslexia specifically. The International Dyslexia Association has just revised the definition of dyslexia. So there's lots of webinars out there about, okay, what does this mean? What should we be doing differently? And the researchers were talking who presented talked about different things, but there was an overarching theme, which is definitely a discussion everywhere, including the folks who study dyslexia, is that reading, writing, and spelling are language-based activities. And I don't know that all of us have received that message in our training. There's been so much discussion over the last few years, thanks in part to Emily Hanford and like phonics and decoding. Although she has said from the I don't know if it was her third sentence, very early on, it's not just all about phonics. But her work pointed out that we've been ignoring that aspect of learning to read too. So we have to have language. We have to teach students how to symbolically represent that language in print, spelling, and learn how to use the symbols of language to figure out what the words are, decoding. So we can think about the truth and the clarity of things like Scarborough's rope, which is a metaphor of how reading develops, and it has language at the top. We could say it's the foundation, but it's of utmost importance. And then decoding, and it all happens, all those little strands getting woven together. Another image that can be helpful to dissuade or move us away from the misunderstandings that reading just happens or it's somehow magical. Uh, and we get that impression sometimes because there is a certain percentage of children who, if exposed to language and print, do teach themselves. It's about perhaps 4 to 5, or maybe a little bit more percent of the population. Those children, that's been well documented, they do exist. And then there's another population, a percentage of the population, 25 or 30% of kids who are going to get it with very little effort on the part of teachers or on their part. Their brains are there are researchers studying those kids. We're not really sure, but we've assumed that that's how it happens for everybody, and it just does not. So along with Scarborough's rope, another visual metaphor that I love is Nancy Young's infographic framework for instruction that she calls the ladder of reading and writing. And that basic metaphor, Scarborough uses the rope metaphor for how learning happens. Nancy uses a ladder metaphor, and it's very similar to it. It reflects good research. It's certainly Stanislas Dehaene and Mark Seidenberg and others. Anybody who studies reading, Scarborough herself, cognitive psychologist, learning to read is a process somewhat like climbing a ladder. There are rungs that you have to go up. Nancy's metaphor, her infographic also shows, there's a ladder. Yeah, you have to climb the ladder. And the message is almost all kids are going to be able to climb that ladder. But the other part of the infographic shows bands of a continuum of ease, colored bands that she calls the continuum of ease. Also very research validated that at the very top there's a dark green. There's a certain percentage of kids that are just going to zoom up that ladder. I mean, by age 4 or 5, they've kind of figured it out. They have a lot more to learn, but it's really magically easy for them. And then there's a certain percentage of kids in the light green that she has that no matter how we teach them, they're probably going to do just fine. And then there's the kids in the orange and the red. They can climb that ladder, absolutely, but it's going to take more thoughtful, considered, planned, systematically designed, explicitly delivered instruction. So, not to get too far away from your question. Your question is, what are the myths? The myth is that this is an easy thing to do and that all we have to do is provide exposure, give kids the opportunity to practice reading and writing with interesting text, and it's all going to happen. That is only true. There's hardly anything that's not true at all. That actually is kind of true for a very small percentage of children. So, but that myth has pervaded in part because it became a model of reading instruction that swept the English speaking world as the way we were training teachers for a long time. And it is still institutionalized in a lot of universities, despite the evidence that just isn't true. So we really need to understand more of the brain-based processes that happen in learning to read that are complicated, but the gift that Hollis Scarborough has given us and that Nancy Young has given us are ways that most of us, mere mortals, can wrap our heads around that complexity. It is like a rope, and there's lots of language and symbolic learning that needs to happen. And it's like a ladder. There's a process and learning more about who our students are and what their differences are and how we can support them.
Yeah, and understanding. I think those are great visuals for teachers to understand the big process, right? And what's happening in the brain. You mentioned dyslexia, and I often hear that students with dyslexia need different instruction.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about that? So when we say students with dyslexia, some people will say need the same instruction, just more of it. What does that practice look like, and how can we tap into those skills and support them?
Yes. Well, I think there was a period of time. I mean, I use that term mere mortals, we mere mortals, who have for 100 years at least been interested in dyslexia. Not I personally. I've been around a long time, but not 100 years. But we can look back and see that it was about 100 years ago where it appeared in literature that people were taking notice of the fact that there was a certain percentage of children, adolescents in the population who had reasonable cognitive abilities or even very strong cognitive abilities who were still struggling to learn to read. And from that first noticing began some interventions and some basic research to try to figure out what was going on. And that research provided a lot of good understandings and some good guidance for us in teaching. But some of that early guidance that emerged from initial examinations of dyslexia has subsequently been found not to be as valuable. What was working, now that we have much, much more sophisticated research techniques and we've got decades to look at things, we can look back at things. What has been parsed out about some of that early work that was more, we could lump it into multisensory teaching. When teachers were using multisensory processes with children with dyslexia, it seemed to work really well. Subsequent research has said, look back at that and said, it did work quite well, but what was actually working was not the multisensory part, but that was always being done with what today we would call systematically designed, explicitly delivered instruction that worked on phonics and the code, as well as developing kids' language. So that is the part that was working. And what we newer research has not said we should discard multisensory, but the idea that because you have dyslexia, you're going to need things like tracing sandpaper letters or tactile rice trays or shaving cream or writing in the air, those kinds of things that fall under multisensory. We don't want to throw those things out. Just like I said, it's like nothing's wrong or right. Those things can be highly motivating. One of the things with kids with dyslexia is they can learn, they can climb that ladder, they can weave that rope together, but it takes much, much longer, many, 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 many more repetitions and practice. So instead of just doing it, the oral way or on a whiteboard or chalk on a chalkboard or something like that, we could do some rice trays or shaving cream just for more practice. But what we need to understand is what the evidence says. The evidence is that it's not the tactile stuff that's making that useful. Use those things for motivation, for the extraordinary numbers of practice that kids with dyslexia have to do. So in my looking at the research, it definitely comes down. The evidence is that we all learn to climb the ladder basically the same way. Some of us, because of challenges within our brain, some of those things are going to be more difficult, and it's going to take more time and more practice at some of those rungs to get up there. To me, that's a very clear message of the last 50 years of research. And then we just have to figure out how to do that, how to meet the needs of the kids. Thinking about Nancy's continuum, well, we're going to have a classroom where there's those kids in the dark green who are 2 or 3 years ahead of the curriculum we have. And then there's those kids in the red who are going to learn, but only with that really carefully designed instruction and lots of it. So that goes back to the systems and structures. We only have so many hours in a day. We need our leaders and the best minds to figure out how can we squeeze as much time for good instruction, and who's going to provide it, so that, and how do we differentiate it so the children who are 2 or 3 years above level are not just sent over to the corner or to the library, just go read. They deserve differentiated instruction that keeps them moving along too. So those are all really big challenges. But I would say the children with dyslexia, I think to me, the evidence is compelling that good instruction is good instruction, that it really does come down to we might call it a dosage issue.
They just need more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I kind of want to shift a little bit because you said something, and I heard you say this, and correct me if I'm wrong because it was 2 years ago, but you talked about fluency and you talked about students who just need that extra dose. They need that extra time. They need multiple repetitions. And something that you said that stuck with me when I was listening to you was that you have to sit in that slow and awkward phase with kids as long as it takes. So when they are decoding and they're trying to decode and they're trying to put all those pieces together, that's an area that I think we have the word piece down, like word mapping and sounding out words and learning to do that. But it's the point between, yes, I know how to sound out words. How do I do it automatically that I think teachers really struggle with? And I'll be honest, I just had a conversation with a teacher today and I said, how are your decodables going? Are you getting to that application piece? And she said, I hate that time of the lesson. And she said, because she said, we just sit forever. We sit, it takes so much work. And I said, that's what you really need to lean into, is allowing them to be able to do that. So would you just talk a little bit about fluency and how we can help kids get from I can decode, I'm starting to put the pieces together to now how do I make this more automatic?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I wish we had the magic answer for that, how to acquire that as quickly as possible for every child, because that is definitely what we want. Um, these days, I'm really leaning in on something that was developed by a colleague of mine, in fact, my co-author, Deb Glazer, when she and I wrote our book about reading fluency, that's actually called Reading Fluency. We wrote the book about that. Um, she created in the section of that book about instruction and intervention, she created a three-part framework for fluency instruction that I sort of recently rediscovered and realized how brilliant it really is. So it's uses the mnemonic of triple A, and that's the framework for instruction across. You could think of Scarborough's rope, which is a developmental model. It starts with beginning reading. I'm learning my letters and sounds. Now I can read words. Now I'm reading decodable text. Triple A stands for accuracy, automaticity, and access meaning. Those three things. And when you look at the research literature about how do we, the work of Linnea Airy, that's now being translated so nicely by Katie Pace-Miles and Molly Ness, about how do we help orthographically map, how create that process of orthographic mapping in our students. And they talk about you need the phonology, you need the orthography, but you also, all of that is facilitated by connecting it to language that the kids understand meaning. So using that triple A framework across the stages is a good reminder for teachers that it's not just about saying the letters correctly, saying them accurately, and getting the word down and then going on to the next word. As soon as, and we should be doing this also from as early as possible, getting words into connected text, because that's when the light bulb starts to go off that, oh, this has meaning. We can, at the very simple level, I often use just the sentence, the dog is big. You know, that sentence, we should have students in the triple A framework read, decode, remember, recognize each of those words. We've worked a lot on the most frequent word in the English language. Hopefully that's been pre-taught. We can sound out dog accurately, and then several times until we can read it more automatically. The dog is big. We get that down at triple A, accuracy, automaticity, and then let's talk about this. What did we just read about? If one of my students say, I'm not sure, say, okay, no problem. Go back and read it again, because the answer is always in the text. You always go back to the text. So no problem. Go back and read it again. That's your job. When you read, you need to be paying attention. The dog is big. Okay, what did we read about? A dog. Yeah. So what do we know about this dog? Do we know it's a girl dog, boy dog, blue dog, brown dog, curly haired, mean dog, funny dog, a real dog, a cartoon dog? We know nothing about this dog except one thing: it's big, and we don't know how big. If we can get language, and we can start bringing language and meaning at the very, very simplest early levels every time, and we don't spend 15 minutes on every simple sentence, but every time we read a word, we need to make sure our students know what that word is or its function. And sometimes it's just real quick, can somebody use that in a sentence, or I'll use it in a sentence, because we want to keep going. Lots and lots and lots of opportunity to respond to. The kids are saying it, they're reading it, they're keeping up that perky pace that Anita Archer talks about. So that accuracy is really important, but automaticity is important. And the accessing meaning is essentially important. That should all be there all the time, with a perky pace, with lots of opportunity to respond, having them read it, See it, I was pointing to the wrong. See it, hear it, say it, and write it. All of those things. That's the newer, more evidence-based approach to multi-sensory. Not multi-sensory as much as multimodality. See it, hear it, say it, write it. If we incorporate, and then keeping AAA as the framework, always accuracy, always automaticity, and always in the purpose of comprehension, in the purpose of understanding what we've read. Um, I think if we did that, we would have more success during that really critical decoding learning time, the transitional time from letter names and letter sounds to more complex text reading. We do want to keep that time as short as possible. Some students are going to need a lot of time there, but we the we want to get them to launch to velocity, to acquiring that alphabetic principle. And it's all the rope all the time. But AAA is a framework I think that teachers can wrap their heads around. And I think it will, if we don't skip any of those steps, it's going to move us through those stages a little faster.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. And just listening to you talk about that, there's so many things that we can pull meaning from,
Yeah.
even in the simplest text. I mean, we were reading a sentence the other day, and it was a little boy was lugging. So it was like, I can lug the bag. What does that mean, right?
What does that mean? I was in a classroom a while ago when I saw first graders read "The boy ate a fig," and the teacher was doing a really, really good job with the first two parts. She got them to read it every word really accurately, and she had them read it several times, so they were quite automatic. But then she turned the page. And while she was turning the page, she wasn't looking at the kids. I was looking at the kids, and they were all like, "What? Ate a what?" And again, you wouldn't necessarily bring a whole plate of figs for the children to have this experience of eating figs and talking about figs. Just, it's a fruit. He ate a fruit. Let's go on. But every time, let's that's what reading is all about. We start with comprehension. I like to use Scarborough's rope backwards. Like, let's start with that tightly woven rope, skilled reading, the fluent execution and coordination of all the pieces. That's the goal. So how do we get there? Backtracking. And for right now, my way of doing that and thinking about it is AAA at every stage.
And that's so easy to understand. That's something teachers can understand immediately.
Yeah, right.
I love.
And lots of good evidence about that value, that hierarchy of you need a base of accuracy, and then you move to fluency, and then you move to adaptation and generalization. We've been studying that for decades.
Yeah. Well, I feel like our time has just gone by so fast, but I have one question that I really want to ask you. And that is about oral reading fluency. I live here in Virginia, and
Mm.
I pulled out your fluency norms about a year ago because we were giving an oral reading fluency assessment with our new assessments to first graders at the beginning of the year. And as you can imagine, that we didn't really get a lot of data from that. And I said, Jan doesn't measure it at the beginning of first grade. So, but I want to talk briefly about that before we get off, because I want to help educators understand how we should be using oral reading fluency data and some common misinterpretations that we might want to avoid when using that ORF data.
Okay. Yeah. Well, it was interesting. The webinar that I listened to just before I joined this meeting today with you, Amie, they mentioned oral reading fluency as an essential tool that teachers, all educators should be using because it's so efficient. It's the quickest tool we have. It's really, really effective in identifying risk. And that's one way of thinking about it. I have for a long time thought about that tool of the 1 minute check of students reading grade level text. I've thought of that as a thermometer. It's very, very analogous to a thermometer, a very quick check that gives you a number. And then you compare that number to a benchmark, and that benchmark tells you about risk. One risk factor. Body temperature has one benchmark from birth to death. It doesn't change 3 times a year, every grade. But we know what that benchmark is, somewhere around 98.6. If you're at or slightly around that benchmark, you're probably, unless there's other things going on in the human body, of course, is very complicated, but you don't have a fever, at least. And that will tell a physician or a parent a lot. Okay, you might not be feeling well, or you might have some other thing going on, but you don't have a fever. ORF, oral reading fluency, words correct per minute, is a measure of your academic temperature. Very quickly gives you a consistent, reliable score. You compare it to a number, and it will tell you, do you have an academic fever or not? It doesn't tell, just a thermometer doesn't tell you why you have a fever. And ORF doesn't tell you why you have an academic fever, why you're not at benchmark. But it tells us a whole lot. It brings together that language, because you're reading syntactically, semantically valuable piece of text. It has something in there that the brain has to process. And we have 50 years. I'm preparing for a webinar that my colleague Jerry Tyndall, who is the co-author of all of those norms, he and I are doing a presentation next week for folks in Great Britain to talk about those norms. And we've been reviewing the research, 50 years of research that keeps telling us that that's a valuable tool. It just brings everything together. And in 1 minute, because of the norms that have been established, we can tell a lot about our students. How should we use it? In that webinar today, they confirmed that idea of 3 times a year, especially at early elementary, is probably a good thing. I think we can nuance that a little bit past 3rd grade. Once kids have shown that they are good readers, we may not need to assess those students again 3 times a year. I think of most value in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, and early 3rd. Maybe we should assess all kids in the fall or the beginning of the year, just to make sure that something hasn't happened and that they're on track. But we don't want to also, I think its greatest value is finding kids who have risk factors. But its second utility is using it to monitor students' progress over time, because it's very sensitive to change. So assessing weekly or sometimes even twice a week for high-risk students, those are good utilities. But misuses are just pushing kids to read faster and faster and faster. There really is no value in that. We want increased fluency. We want accuracy and automaticity and understanding what has been read, which is evidenced by good expression. We want to continue to build background knowledge and all of those kind of knowledges. But we also want to teach kids reading and other things too. So just pushing kids over focusing on just that score of fluency as if that's the gold standard, we want to keep going higher and higher. There's just not evidence that there's value in that. Get kids to a level of fluency somewhere between the 50th and the 75th percentile seems to be the game changer. So we want to work to help kids get there, but not pushing them doing drills of speed reading and faster. It's just not worth it. You're at benchmark, you're strongly at benchmark. Let's use our instructional time for all the complex stuff, including writing and spelling. So that's a caution that I would say. It's very important, but let's not overdo it.
So it's really just a window into, if a student is struggling, why are they struggling? And it gives you so much information.
It gives you that peak that they're struggling. And then usually we have to dig a little deeper beyond just a 1 minute assessment to figure out why are they not able to read grade level text at a benchmark. Is it language? Is it decoding? And parse those out a little bit more beyond that 1 minute assessment.
Right. That makes sense. Well, I could sit here and I could listen to you all day, but we don't have all day. So I have just a few questions to close us out. I want to know what signs of progression or momentum give you hope in our field right now.
I would say probably the biggest one is that I've been very hopeful about is what's happening at our institutions of higher education, the educator preparing preparatory programs are starting to shift. There's really we see more and more interest in professors of reading and literacy to engage with the science of reading ideas and make some changes in their programs to prepare future educators, and that's going to make a world of difference. So that's really good. I do see materials, curriculum materials, and intervention supports. There's just a plethora. There's lots and lots of really good materials out there now. So there's really no excuse for schools to leave teachers scrambling on teachers pay teachers or using materials that have been proven to be ineffective. So I'm hopeful for the future in our teacher preparation, but I think it's an exciting time. Our tools and resources are really quite strong now, and that leaves us all potentially in a much better place.
Yeah, for sure. If you could leave every educator listening to this podcast with one clear, actionable message about reading instruction, what would it be?
I think it would be about reading instruction itself. I am a huge fan, acolyte of Dr. Jack Fletcher, whose work over many, many decades about how the brain works and how children learn to read. He and a very large number of colleagues did a study back in the early 2000s where they were for the very first time in research using brain scans along with traditional ways of assessing students' reading. And that information just kind of changed our world about how we understand the brain and how it works. But in that article, they used the term teachers need to understand, or they use the sentence that teachers need to understand that what they're doing is brain surgery by instruction. And they showed pictures of that. Before instruction, the brain was not very functional. After instruction, weeks, sometimes just weeks of instruction, the brain changed. The brain changed how it was functioning. And that happened not through surgery by a surgeon, it happened through a teacher. Teaching is brain surgery. And the more precise and accurate and consistent the term you use too, we change brains. We change them every day. And that's just incredibly exciting for me because and sometimes you can see it, I really believe that those moments when we watch a child kind of like the light bulb goes on and they get it, that's likely a a synapse that has been created. Suddenly there's, oh, I understand now. And it's good instruction that does that, keeping those children feeling safe and valued and excited, and giving them good new information that empowers their own independent abilities. There's nothing like that. So let's just keep doing that good brain surgery through instruction for those little children who depend on us for that.
Well, if that isn't a motivating statement to end on, I don't know what is. So thank you so much. I think it's so important, and the work we do is so important. And like you said, our profession is undervalued, but we have a lot to give. And we're in this profession because we love what we do. So thank you so much for being here with us. Would you just briefly tell people how they can find you if they want to learn more from you?
Yes. I have a website. It's not a very active website, but if you search for Jan Hasbrook, you can find that website. I try to stay somewhat involved on what used to be Twitter. I don't know what it's called now, but also through LinkedIn and other social media where I like to be there because people are connecting. Ooh, here's a good webinar. Here's a good training. Here's a new book or an article. So you can find me sharing what I've learned and what I know on those websites.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here.